Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Organized, a webinar series on organizational capacity building. I am your host, Leisha McKinley Beach. The Emory University Campus Coordinating Center created this monthly webinar series to share with a broader audience of Southern nonprofit professionals some key information to support your efforts on creating and sustaining an organization performing stellar work in Southern communities. These webinars were designed for the busy nonprofit professional on the go to get a quick training and resources to support these efforts. Each webinar will highlight one or more of the 8 core areas of our capacity building trainings. If you're looking for one-on-one trainings, we invite you to submit a request on our website by clicking on the training links. Today's webinar, Organization Structure or Restructure, What You Need to Know Before Doing Both, will highlight a few strategies and tools that all CBOs should consider when thinking of setting up your organization. Now, restructuring is a word most of us are familiar with in nonprofit, but knowing the right structure and what will lead your agency into the future can be quite difficult and nerve-wracking. With recent shifts in our work and daily lives due to COVID-19 pandemic, we've all had to change the way we operate, including the restructure of service delivery or lack thereof during the shelter-in-place order for many states. And what I want to do right now is I just want to pause before we bring up our dynamic speaker on today and to say on behalf of the Emory Campus Coordinating Center, know that our thoughts and prayers are with each of you as we go through this difficult period. And what we believe to be true is that we will get through this together. Today, I'm very honored to bring up our expert in organization structural planning and operation. Will you please help me welcome Ms. Monique Childress. Monique?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you for the introduction and thanks for having me on today's call. My name is Monique Childress and I'm the founder of Horizon Advisory Group. And today I'll be sharing some information with you all about setting up your organization for success, whether you are a new organization or one in transition. A little bit about Horizon is that our goal is to strengthen and structure the mission-driven organizations that enrich our communities through people strategies such as organizational development, strategic planning, and team building, problem-solving facilitations. Over the last 8 years, I've focused my consulting efforts on the people strategies of for-profit and nonprofit clients, both big and small. And through that experience, I came to realize that across these various industries and missions, that what's common for every leader is the need to set priorities, to serve your clients and your audiences well, and to grow and lead your teams. And as many of you may have experienced, founders and leaders of more established nonprofit organizations, you often know that something needs to change in order to grow or to survive, but maybe you don't know exactly what it is. And so you may be thinking about how do you grow your staff? How do you keep your staff? People aren't performing. How do you get more help from the board? And those are some of the type of things that we work with our clients on to really help identify opportunity areas and to help you plan from there. So today we'll go into defining the structure of your organization, what it looks like when the structure is out of place, how it shows up across your own organization's life cycle, and when it may be time to restructure. Before we get started, for those of you on the phone, if you could just maybe in the chat, just let me know how long you've been in operation and how many staff members you have, just to help to tailor the information to where it's most effective. And then I'll keep the chat up. And as we go through the presentation, if there's any questions that may come up and you want me to pause, feel free to raise your hand or just send a note through the chat and we'll be sure to get those answered. So we can move to the next slide. So in the most simple terms of an organizational structure, the way that I like to think about it is that the structure defines how information and work flows through your organization. And that can be between internal counterparts as well as external. And the structure that you choose, it really does impact your organization's success in carrying out your mission and your objectives. Next slide. Thank you. So before we get into what the structure is made of, I provided just a few examples here of what it could look like when the structure is out of place or it has some gaps. And that could kind of let you know that maybe the organizational structure needs some refinement. So if you come to a point where especially if you're in a larger organization where you've had to eliminate some roles, but the work has not been eliminated, then you know that that can negatively affect the staff's morale. You may have people stepping into roles where they don't have the skill sets, and so there's some performance issues as well as confidence as well. And then there's just a gap in how the information is flowing. It can also show up when your executive director, maybe your executive staff, even some of your board members, when they're focused on the more tactical day-to-day operations of the organization, they don't have as much time to really think about what is the strategic direction of the organization. And so the organization gets stuck in the day-to-day and not really on growth or being ready for any type of changes. And then there's a few other ways that this can show up with unqualified staff or board members. If your teams are just less engaged in the work. But I think what also, just given the time that we're in, what I've noticed with a lot of my clients is that they've really been able to see how prepared they are to lead through change when a crisis such as COVID-19 comes into play. And often it doesn't take a crisis as big as COVID-19 to really start to show some of the gaps in your organization. But I think this is a good time for all of us to reflect as we look to move forward. And I know there's a lot of questions about, how will we operate in the future? What will my organization look like once we return to whatever normal is over the next few months? It's really a time to look to see what really showed up here that we might want to focus on so that we don't get caught again with another crisis. So next step, next slide. So often when I talk about an organizational structure, typically it's commonly thought of as, oh, it's the org chart. It's what we have, we have boxes and we have lines and titles and maybe even names about what our organization looks like on a page. And that is one piece of the structure that you'll need to develop. But it also includes, as you can see here, so you have your board, you have your executive director, and then you have your staff. But it also your structure also needs to account for how your funders are engaged, how your partners are engaged, how you serve your community, and how you serve your clients. And so putting the org chart together is one step in actually fully developing out how your organization comes together from a structural standpoint. So if you move to the next slide, these are just some of the elements of a full organization structure and how they come together. As you can see in the image on the right, the org chart is just one part of the outputs of this work. So when you are, especially if you're a new organization, what you really want to think about is what are the jobs that we have. So for the executive director, that could be what are the actions that they take every day, what are they responsible for, what are their expected outputs for the year, who do they manage, what skill sets are needed, and then doing that for each role. I recommend also doing it for your board as well. Departmentation. So as you grow, how is your organization divided into departments? It can be a one-person department, just FYI, but do you have someone focused on marketing and communications? Do you have someone focused on more specific around programming? Do you have someone focused primarily on finance? What about development, etc.? That's how you really start to think of departments. Delegation is how the work flows through the organization. So when you start off, you may only have your executive director and your board, but everything can't fall on one person. Even though from I'm sure everyone's experience on this call, there are times when it does feel like all of the work really does rest with one person. But ideally, a lot of that work should be delegated and likely by strengths, either to different board or committee members or to your staff. Span of control and chain of command, those are things to really think of as your organization grows. So span of control is about how many people, especially like on average, does each manager manage? So does each manager have 3 people reporting to them? Do they only have 1? Does someone have 10 people, for example? And that's something just to look at, just to understand, to make sure that work is evenly spread throughout the organization, as well as no one gets too overloaded. And then reporting lines, chain of command, going back to that org chart, that's really just understanding who reports into whom in order to better track performance. And before we move on to what types of structures could come about, I will kind of pause here just in case anyone has any questions. Okay, looks like we're good to go. So as we move on to the next slide, there are many types of organizational structures, but they pretty much fall into 3 buckets. Most organizations, whether it be a nonprofit or a for-profit, but especially with nonprofits, pretty much start off fairly flat. And so this is a less formal structure, and what it really means is that there's not a lot of hierarchy. Most of the decision making kind of rests within different people. It doesn't all sit in one location. And the good thing about this is everyone pretty much works together as just like one big team. There's not a lot of silos of information or responsibilities. And you're able to really just utilize everyone's talents in order to respond to whatever it is that your communities need. As organizations mature a bit, they move into more of a hierarchical structure or a pyramid structure. And that's really where you see a lot of the decision making really just sits at the top, whether it be the board or the executive director or both. And this is where you see those departments that I talked about. Those start to show up as employees start to get grouped by functions. They can also get grouped by region. So there are some of you who may have an organization that focuses on a hyper local community. And so you, in that instance, you wouldn't really be separated by region. But if you're serving the southeastern region of the United States, then maybe you have you break it down into, okay, one person per state, or one person has a group of states, another person has a group of states, and that would be looked at by region. And then lastly, there's also a split of if you have multiple offerings for your organization, breaking down the organization to focus on having teams broken down per program or per service that you offer. The last structure, which is a matrixed organization, that is usually seen in a lot larger organizations than most startups, but it could be effective, especially if you're focusing on a special project like strategic planning or restructuring. So I'll actually come back to that in the next few slides. But I think what's really important just to take away here is that there's no one set structure that every nonprofit organization should follow. It's really just considering what information do we all need to share, what programs or services are we offering, and what really makes sense for us as our organization grows and starts to mature. So on the next slide, we'll take a look at a typical organization life cycle. And I started to talk a little bit about the startup phase, the growth phase, the maturity phase, et cetera. But really, how you should think about it is when you're in the startup phase, this is when pretty much you started to apply for your 501c3, or you've recently received it. You have your board members in place, and maybe it's just those starting 3 that you need for that designation. You've started to provide some sort of programming offer, but you're really just new and green and learning. And then eventually, as word starts to spread, as your work starts to get some attention, you get into that growth phase. And growth can typically be overwhelming for a lot of leaders, because that's when you start to see, okay, we need more help. So we need to hire more programming staff. We need to bring on more volunteers. We need to expand our board. The growth phase is really where you start to see where a lot of your gaps are in terms of skill sets, and it can help you to further define what structure you need. As you go into maturity, you're a little bit older, you have your more established programs, you start to be known for your programs. People are starting to come to you to help or volunteer or to get hired, and your board is pretty much filled out. Um, the decline stage, I will say that not everyone goes into a decline, into the decline phase of the life cycle. There's many organizations that have been around for decades, but if we think about the purpose of most nonprofit organizations is to solve a problem. And so ultimately, the goal for most nonprofits should be to no longer be in existence and therefore going into a decline. But one thing that I'd like to point out is that a lot of people or a lot of organizations will actually circle back through that startup to maturity phase a number of times before they head into that decline phase. And that's because they may need some transitions or some turnaround efforts. But eventually, what leads an organization towards that declining phase, and so maybe they start to shrink their structure a bit. It could be a loss of funding. It could be just not being able to adapt to the needs of your communities, or a number of other reasons. But what I'd like to focus on, because I think the audience for the Compass Initiative is mostly in that startup to growth phase, I'd like to focus on the next slide about what early organizational structures tend to rely on. And that's mostly the board, that founding board. I think you need 3 members to get your 501c designation, 501c3 designation. And the board is really there to bring the ideas of the organization into reality. This is where I actually see a lot of the clients that I work with, a lot of them struggle, not necessarily finding people to join their board, but as they start to grow, they realize that the board members that they started with may not be the board members to get them to that next level. When we talked about here's what it looks like when your organization is out of place, sometimes you get your friends, you get your family members, you get some referrals to join your board to start with, and they truly believe in the mission. but they're not really vetted to see what skills they may actually bring or how much time they're going to actually spend to help you get the organization off the ground. What resources can they provide, whether it be financial donations or being able to fundraise, or even if it's just bringing on their using their connections and their relationships to further the mission of the organization. And so getting out of that startup phase and into growth and towards maturity, the board plays a huge role in the structure of the organization. As you look on the right, there's I just wanted to call out that there's a difference between having a working board and a governing board. I talked a lot about the organization structure and the staff and the teams, etc. But the reality is that a lot of organizations will start off with a working board and an executive director and not necessarily a staff right away. And so as you think about a working board, these are essentially your unpaid staff. And so while the unpaid part means that they need to be intrinsically motivated and really believing in the mission, the staff part of it means that they need to have some skills to actually carry out your programming. In terms of a governing board, so as you can see here, all nonprofits must have a governing board. And so in the early stages, sometimes the board will wear those two hats. But the governance part is equally as important as the work, the unpaid work that they may do in the beginning, because they are really helping to provide the leadership and the direction of the organization. They should be able to sit back and think about what is the strategic direction of the organization outside of the day to day. And so they may monitor the impact that occurs from your programs or your services, but they'll also be able to think 2, 3, 5 years ahead about what the needs of the communities that you serve, what those needs will be, and how to position your organization correctly to fulfill those needs. There's also a financial component. And so whether that be they have a commitment to provide certain financial resources to the organization, either from their own pockets or from their fundraising efforts. But they also need to think about additional resources that can be donated instead of funds. So it could be equipment or materials or other in-kind donations such as marketing help, etc. On the next slide, we'll revisit the life cycle. And as I mentioned, a lot of times, most nonprofit organizations, or really just organizations in general, will cycle through from startup to maturity a number of times before they actually tend to go out of operation. And this can be a transformation, it can be a turnaround. There can be a number of reasons of why a organization will go from the maturity phase and back to growth. And on the next, but most likely, any of those reasons will be the need for a restructuring. So on the next slide, if we think about what does it mean to restructure the organization. So let's say you're no longer a startup, you've been in operation, and there is a need to take a new direction. One hallmark of a well-organized organization and really a well-defined structure is that you're able to adapt and realign as much as you need. And typically, you always want to consider what the needs of your community or your audience are so that your structure can easily adapt and respond. What you don't want to do is to get rid of your core capabilities or whatever sets you apart, but maybe it's in how you deliver your resources or how your teams are structured, or maybe it's adding on more responsibilities to your roles, or even just looking for additional skill sets of new hires. On the next slide, there's some questions that as a leader of an organization, you'll need to ask yourself in terms of when is it time to restructure the organization? And these are appropriate whether we're in a crisis or not. But if there's any specific questions about what to do in terms of this crisis, I will gladly take those when we get into the Q&A portion. But what will always be consistent is that your organization should constantly, whether it's quarterly or annually, take stock on the impact that you're making within your community and understanding if your organization is actually meeting their needs. If not, you may need to revisit your mission and maybe even your vision to see if it still applies. And you also will want to evaluate your staff's performance. Both of those will be good indicators to understand if there's a need to restructure a part of your organization or if there's another remedy required. If you do have to revisit your mission and vision and make some changes, that's just one example of a change that will require at least taking a look to see if there's any changes that need to be made to the roles or the responsibilities of the organization. Other instances could be if you have a new executive director, or if you're bringing on a new development manager or finance team, etc. Additional changes could be external. So the needs of your community have changed. Maybe you're impacted by new regulations, a new administration, whether it be local, state, or federal, or a pandemic like COVID-19. If you have a new program to offer or new services, or if you've had to just rapidly expand your staff or your volunteers, or you notice the opposite, there's been a rapid decline in the number of your staff and volunteers. Those are all times to consider restructuring. And then lastly, if there's any internal organizational issues, there's poor performance or poor behaviors that you're noticing, when you look into the root causes, if any of the roots reflect a confusion of roles, a lack of communication, a duplication of efforts, those are all signals that something needs to change in the structure of your organization. On the next slide, here's just a common list of what does it mean to actually restructure. And so when we looked at those questions about, these are the questions that we need to constantly ask ourselves as we, especially if we're rounding that corner from maturity onto decline. When you think about if it's time for a transformation or a turnaround, maybe you don't need to completely restructure the organization, but maybe you do. But sometimes there could just be you adding on new roles or maybe changing a current role. And that could be a new job title, you're adding on responsibilities, you're updating the skill sets that are required. Maybe there's, for example, we've all switched to Zoom calls and other video conferencing programs. And so if you're hiring during this time, maybe one of those new skills that or proficiencies that are required is that they are comfortable with using Zoom or whatever technology that you use. It could be Slack or Microsoft Teams, Basecamp, Asana, etc. That would be an example of a minor restructuring. You've updated someone's job description. You might also move your teams around. Maybe you've had to reduce your staff or reduce your staff or reduce a certain role. And maybe if it was a manager, now you have to think about where did their direct reports, who do they report into? And so this slide is really just to show that when we think about restructuring the organization, it can look different. It doesn't have to be a full out year-long effort, even though it could be. But for most organizations, especially those that are smaller, those that are newer, when you're bringing on a new staff or you're trying to adapt to change, what I would recommend is that you take a step back to consider if we do need to restructure, what is most important to do? If we update our job descriptions, for example, and that can help us to get better recruits in terms of volunteers or staff members or even board members, will that help us to better make the impact that we're looking to do? And that could be the difference of a 4-hour working session with your leadership versus actually bringing on a consultant for, let's say, a 6 to 8 week engagement to change everything about your organization. And I mention this just because I'm sure a lot of you will have questions about, well, how long does this take? And do I actually need to revamp everything just because we changed our mission? And the answer in terms of how long it takes is it does depend. But what I would suggest is that, or what I really want to highlight is that when you think about restructuring your organization, it should not be a quick decision. It should be something that is intentional and well thought out. Even in times like this where we're in a crisis and everyone is worrying, and if the funding, is the funding going to come in? Do we need to let some people go? Just consider that whatever decisions you will have to make, take time, talk it through with your board, talk it through with your leadership team, and really consider, is this a temporary change that we'll have to make, or is it permanent? And if it's permanent, what will we then need to consider if we've changed our organization? So if we do need to let some people go, for example, who will then take on those responsibilities? Who were they contacting with outside of the organization? And where will we now create a new point of contact? If it's the opposite and you're now helping out your community in need, let's say if you are supporting with supplies or food, and you need to bring on more staff, you have the funding to do so, or even volunteers. It's taking the time to consider, can you handle an influx of new staff members or new volunteers? What will their roles be? Once the pandemic starts to die down, will they remain a permanent staff member or a volunteer? And if so, what will their roles turn into once there's no longer this need for crisis response? I'll pause here and see if there's any questions here in terms of structuring your organization or restructuring. Okay, you go to the next slide. Good. Okay, well, it doesn't seem like there's any questions right now. Leisha, where should we take the conversation? Oh, I do see a question here. So what are some tips you can offer agencies who may be going through the process of determining if change needed is short-term or permanent? Do you recommend having this discussion with an outside consultant? Yeah, so initially I would say, in terms of recommending an outside consultant, my first response would be no, even though I am an outside consultant. I think it's a discussion that you have with your board, and that's where we get back into, you have your working board or your governing board. Your board should really be making a decision or helping you to make the decision on making any of these changes. So if you're bringing on, if you're creating new roles, if you're creating new programs, if you're bringing on new leaders, and then if you're removing any of those, I think that could be a 1 or 2 hour call, depending on how many changes you're trying to make and how many people are on the call. So I would start with the board first and just go through some different scenarios. If the board and the leadership cannot come to an agreement on that call, I think it would be wise to consider bringing in a consultant, but just to determine whether it's a short-term or permanent change, I would only consider a consultant if you're trying to understand uh, something outside of the skill set of those on the call. So if you need to bring in, for example, if your changes are around hiring, you may want to bring in an HR consultant who can help to really determine like the cost benefits of remaining lean versus actually bringing on roles. They can also help you to understand what the market is like if you are looking to hire, and the type of people who are available. If you are making other changes, maybe let's say there's an issue with your funding, that's where you may want to explore bringing on a development consultant who can help you to kind of think through the longer term impact. So maybe if you need to change your fundraising strategy, for example, if you're heavily reliant on grants and your foundations have, most of your foundations have started to switch their priorities. Well, if you're over leveraged on foundational grants, then that's when you may want to bring in a developmental consultant to understand the short term and the long term impacts. But yeah, again, just repeating myself in the beginning of those conversations, I think it's just with your board and your leadership.
Thank you for that, Monique. I actually do have one other question that's come in.
Mm-hmm.
What tips can you offer for rearranging roles during COVID-19 that will still be in place after the pandemic?
Yeah, so to clarify, is this about switching some responsibilities?
Yeah, I mean, reading the question, I think that that's what the ask is. Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So,
Mm-hmm.
so one of the things that I'm working on with one of my clients right now is to really take a stock of all of the offerings that you had before COVID-19, and really understanding what are your priority offerings that can best support your community's needs through this pandemic. So if there is something, and there's also considering if there is a program, for example, like food delivery or distribution to communities that are in need or sick and shut in or elderly, et cetera. That may not be a core program, but if there is a capacity that you have that you can partner with another organization, for example, to bring to your community and your audience, those are the type of things I would first take stock in to see what, if anything, are you offering that's different specifically for COVID-19, and then assign a person or a role, a person or a team to be responsible for that in the way that you might have like a program director for one of your other offerings. In terms of, um, because if it's only for COVID-19, I would consider that to be a temporary responsibility. And so there wouldn't be concrete changes to the job descriptions themselves, but I would consider if you're adding on any responsibilities to any one person, what will you then have to take off of their plate from a responsibility perspective? And so that's where you're really just understanding what are our priorities as an organization right now, because that will then translate into what you want your staff or your board members to focus on. In terms of the second part of the question, which I believe was making changes for COVID and then how that looks beyond the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. That's
I think
correct.
if you were to make those changes and add on the responsibilities and then take on the less important responsibilities away, as we do come out of this pandemic, whatever programming that you've been offering, you'll really need to talk that through with your team. So for those who've had added responsibilities, if you are no longer offering that specific programming once the pandemic is done, so for using the example of connecting food distribution and delivery to your audiences, if that's something that you're no longer doing beyond this COVID-19, then as the shelter at home orders start to fade away, is talking to your team about how to slowly die that down, and then being clear, especially as a leader, about what you would like for their priorities to be moving forward. So what you're really just having are these priority setting conversations and being clear that with everyone to know who's working on what today, and then moving forward, what the priorities are. I do strongly believe there will be a strong shift in priorities, but
Mm-hmm.
as I think about how that could then impact, let's say, performance evaluations, or as you get closer to think about the end of the year and your annual reports and your impacts, being able to communicate clearly with your staff, with your board, with your partners and your community, how your priorities shifted, what you did to address those priorities, and then what your priorities will be moving forward. I think that communication is just very key all around in terms of any changes that you've made to your structure.
Okay. We have two more questions that have come in. The first one, we just had an organization restructure before the coronavirus pandemic. What can we do now to ensure the organization continues to thrive?
Yeah, so the biggest key here, my background, like I said, is in people strategies, and a huge portion of that was through change management. And so this is a casebook, a textbook example of being able to strongly lead through change in order for your organization to survive. I'm not sure what the specific restructure was for your specific organization, but the biggest thing that you can do from a change management perspective is to over communicate with your staff, and your board, about whatever progress that you're making, what those priorities are, etc. And being mindful of, if you just did a restructure, in times of crisis, people tend to revert back to the old way of doing things. And so again, I don't know exactly what the restructure was that you did, but I would be mindful as a leader to watch out for behaviors that may tend to lean towards whatever your structure was before. So for example, if you restructured your teams, for example, before this, if people start to revert back to their old point of contact because that's just what's easier to do, instead of whoever their new point of contact is in the way that you've restructured, watch out for that. Over communicate, that the we restructured for this reason, and this is how we'll use it moving forward. Because that would be the one thing that I think might threaten how you all survive, is just falling back on what worked in the past. But again, you restructured for a reason. Just continue to over communicate that, and hold people accountable to it.
Okay. And again, before I read the final question that we have, if you have any additional questions, please use your chat feature to submit them. And so, Monique, the last question I have is, how can an executive director convince the board to do a restructure?
Yeah, this is a really great question, because the board definitely needs to be on board with any sort of restructuring that you have. One, I think the way that I would coach my client, my executive director clients, to talk to their board, is to call out, not just that we need to restructure, but really identify what changes need to be made. So, for example, if there is an issue with staff performance, for example, there's a lack of communication, information isn't shared, deadlines are missed, etc. That could be a reason to start a restructuring effort, in terms of maybe the wrong people are in the wrong roles, or there's a lack of certain skills that your people have. Maybe there's a process issue even in how information is shared, but you won't know that until you actually start this an assessment and then a restructuring process. So I would go to the board with what are the specific changes that need to be made, and bring up examples and bring up how there's a negative impact. Also, let's say if you lost funding for a specific role, and there's a gap, and there's a gap in capacity, but the work still needs to get done. That's another example of bringing it to the board to say, hey, this work still needs to get done, but we need to be able to fill the gap, and we either need to split that former full-time position across all of our staff members, or we may need to hire a new person. Um, so really honing in on the changes that need to be made and the impact that it's making on your organization today, because that's really the cost. And it might not be an actual financial cost that you're bringing to them, although it could, but really you're bringing to them, here is the cost to the organization if we stay the same.
Very informative response. Thank you for that. And here's one that we often hear from nonprofits as well, and that is, how can we restructure our board of directors without forcing them out?
This is a really good question. So, and it's necessary. So I think the biggest thing is to look at what current documents do you have in terms of your bylaws and your commitment forms or contracts or whatever you call it within your organization, to really see what are the current board members, what standards or expectations are they being held to, and then takes start to just kind of jot down maybe where the board is missing the mark. Often I've seen, for example, one client that I was speaking with, they were really, frustrated. The board wasn't raising any funds. They weren't bringing in any sort of donations or anything like that. But when you look at their documents, well, the board wasn't required to. There was no financial commitment. And so one thing to look at is, how can you update and really lay out, here's the expectations for the board moving forward, and get them to sign a new recommitment form. For some board members, they may not want the extra responsibilities that will come with what the organization moves forward with, and they may opt out and may decide not to re-sign. A huge thing I would suggest implementing is having terms for your board members. So there's some organizations, especially when you're starting, it's hard to really think in the future about how long you would like for each board member to sit on your board. And what it is basically, you could say any person that's brought on as a board of director, they have a 2-year term. And at the end of that 2-year term, they can reapply and get re-voted back on the board, or they can use that term to let somebody else go for that seat. That way, no one is essentially getting kicked off. Their term is just over. But I think really just being clear, having those expectations, asking them to sign the bylaws, especially if you don't have them in place right now, will really lay that out. The third and the final thing is, what everyone really needs to do in terms of a board of directors that may be missing the mark is to take a look at what are all the skills and the experiences and the resources that each of your current board members are bringing to the organization. And then as an executive director, I would take a look at what are the skills that you are bringing to the organization, and then start to see where the gaps are. So you may have people who are great at marketing or grant writing or something else. But what you really need is someone who's good at finance, so they can help you make projections. They can help you to manage your funds a little bit better. Or maybe you need help with some uh, legal assistance and legal skill sets. And so those are really the board members that you would look to bring on the next time that you're lining up the board or having an application process. And that can also, again, go with that self-selection. People might self-select out if they realize that the skills that they're bringing are not needed and therefore not utilized by the board. So really providing just similar to the last question, making the case for in this case, here's what the board needs to operate effectively and to be able to lead this organization. Here's the requirements and the expectations and the commitments that you're asking of your board members, and then letting them kind of decide or self-select out if they can be held to those standards or not. Did that answer the question? Hey, can you still hear me?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
My call, it just dropped, and I was talking only to myself.
Okay.
So that's all the questions that have come in so far. And let me just say, Monique, thank you so much for this presentation today. It was very informative and extremely timely as these conversations are happening with our organizations right now, some with some temporary changes and some that may become permanent changes as they see how they're able to continue to function even in the midst of this current pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
To our participants today, please don't forget to complete your survey. And this will be sent out immediately following this webinar. And the information that you provide on that survey, it helps us to determine future webinars and trainings that will be beneficial for you. Again, thank you, Ms. Childress, so much for your presentation, and thank you to the participants for listening and asking some very great questions. This webinar will be available on our website for reference. And if you want to learn more about this topic or request a training, please simply apply to our website at gileadcompass.com. Tune in next month, Thursday, May 21st. And the topic is going to be how to know if your organization is ready for nonprofit status. I'm certain that will be a great one as well. Until next time, I think I'm getting another message. Okay, until next time, everyone have a great day. Be safe and be healthy.